Okay, hello everybody, welcome to video number 4 on biology of the great white shark. Now, in the last video, I was talking about distribution, just to remind myself. And we spoke about distribution and how they move and all the rest of it. Now, I'm going to go a little bit deeper in this video into the actual movement. And we spoke about, in the last video, we spoke about were they territorial, and I said no, they are not territorial. But this is touching on behavior as well. And we're going to, when we're talking about behavior of the great white shark, we're also going to be discussing this as well. It all overlaps. The biology of the white shark, their complex behavior, it all overlaps. So what I'm going to be talking about now is carrying on from territorialism. They're not territorial animals, as I said. They don't stick around an area. They don't decide, this is my spot and you're not allowed here. They move. As I said to you, they've got this home range, and they've got a massive range, etc., etc. But the question that comes up, now when they collect around islands, such as a seal colony or a certain fish reef or something, there's certain behaviors that take place. So they do collect around specific areas, and these are the areas that are referred to as white shark sites. But we're going to discuss that more in depth in white shark behavior, in complex white shark behavior. But for now, in this video, I just want to discuss a bit more about their movement, which is connected to their distribution. I'm going to do it as an example. Okay. So we will have, in the early 90s, we were doing a population dynamics study on great white sharks. Now, population dynamics looks at the size mix of the population, the sex ratio of the population. It looks at movement, abundance. It looks at seasonality. It looks at environmental conditions and how do environmental conditions affect the animals, etc., etc. So it's basically to figure out what does the population do, what is happening with the great white population along the southern African coastline. So it was population dynamics of great white sharks along the southern African coastline. And how we did it, we went to specific white shark sites, such as Dyer Island, such as False Bay, Straits Bay, Moss Bay, and we tagged great white sharks. We tagged them. And as I mentioned in an earlier video, I tagged about 500 animals, 500 different great white sharks of all different sizes. Animals from 2 meters, 1.8 meters to 5 meters long. And it was very easy. We never hooked the animals. We never injured them. We would just draw them to the boat. And how we did it, it would be teamwork. So one of my crew would be handling the bait line, and it would be like a 10-meter rope with a float on the end of it. And under the float would be a little hook, not a fishing hook, but just a little clip. And we would tie a tuna head or a piece of seal or whatever as a bait, and we'd clip it onto the hook. And that crewman would toss the bait out while another crewman would be chumming the water to keep the sharks interested. And then a shark would come in, and he's a shark wrangler. The guy handling the bait rope is a shark wrangler. Now, let's say one of my shark wranglers, his name was Lo. Lo would then guide the bait in like a carrot in front of a donkey. And then the shark would follow the bait in. And it's actually a very precise skill. Handling a great white shark and actually guiding it into the right position for tagging is a real skill, because as the shark comes in following that bait, I can't just tag the shark, because now I've got a 4-meter long aluminium tagging pole. And at the end of the pole, there would be something about this thick, a little bit thinner than this. And yeah, say half as thick as this. It would be a spike, and in the front of it there would be a slot, and you got a blade about this big, a stainless steel blade that slots into the slot like that. It's actually designed for it, so it slips in, and then it's got a short cable, and on the end of the cable we had a plaque tag. Now, a plaque tag was 70 millimeters long by 40 millimeters wide and about 2 millimeters thick, or 2.5 millimeters thick. And on each side of the tag would be a alphabetical number. So it would be A or B or C. So we'd have 26 plaque tags with A to Z on them, and it would be yellow. So we had 26 yellow plaque tags. So we tag a shark, boom, with tag A, we'd know that that shark is shark A yellow. Once we got to Z, then we go to white plaque tags from A to Z. So we could tag a shark and say that shark is white D. So it was very easy to identify the different sharks because we tagged them and we could identify them, and other volunteers along the coastline, whenever they saw one of our great white sharks swimming past with a tag on it, and it was white A or yellow A or green A or red A, they could just contact us, phone me up and say, listen, just saw a shark, it had a X on a yellow plaque tag, and we could quickly go back into the data and, oh, okay, so X was tagged in in Gansbaai 3 months and 9 days ago, and it's just been sighted in Mossel Bay or in False Bay. So it was a very easy, inexpensive way of monitoring the population. A fantastic way, actually, of monitoring the population. So the shark would be drawn in by the wrangler. I'd be standing next to Lo with the tagging pole, and Lo's job was to get the shark to turn. So he'd pull the bait in such a way that the shark would follow, and as the shark got to the bait, right by the boat, Lo would pull the bait out the water, and the shark would turn. And as the shark turned like that, so here's the shark, okay? So the shark's coming in like this towards the boat. Let's say I'm the boat, let's say my mouth is the boat, the shark's coming in, and it turns like this. And as it turns away, I would then take the tagging pole and zap it there or there. I would try and put the tag right in this crease by the dorsal fin. So it was very visible. So every time the shark came up, you'd see the tag over here, or on this side, whichever way the shark turned on that particular occasion. And we tagged, like I say, I tagged personally about 500 sharks. So I did most of the tagging. So we tagged roughly 500 great white sharks. And what would happen is that, for example, we'd go out today and we'd have 6 sharks, or let's say we'd have 8 sharks at the boat, and I would tag 8 sharks, right, at Dyer Island. So I tag 8 sharks, and then tomorrow we go back out to sea, and of the 8 sharks we tagged, we'd resight 6 of them, and there'd be 3 new ones that come in, and I would tag maybe 2 of the new ones, get to tag 2 of them or 1 of them. And the following day we'd go out to sea, and we might see 6 of the sharks we had tagged over the last 2 days, but there would be another new one that had moved in. And as we go on, the next day we might only see 5 of the sharks that we tagged. And then the following day, 2 of the sharks that we hadn't seen for 2 days would suddenly return. And we don't know where, in that period of time, we don't know where they had been. And after a week or so, other sharks would move in, and the sharks we'd been tagging, they'd move out, and then they'd come back, and sometimes they'd move away for 2 weeks or 3 weeks or a month or 3 months, and then they'd return. And that's how we started getting an idea of their movement. And also, that is how we figured out where these white shark sites were, because we had people like Chris Fellows. He's a very good friend of mine. He used to be one of my best volunteers. He's very famous for taking pictures of great white sharks breaching out the water. Awesome guy, loves great white sharks, loves all shark species. I remember one day Chris phoned me up. I was on the boat and he said, "Hey Craig, I've just seen a shark with yellow, I can't remember, yellow Y or something it was. I can't remember. But, or yellow E. It was yellow E. It was tag yellow E. And I said to Chris, how big do you think that shark is? And Chris says it's 5 meters. And I said, that's what we said, 5 meters. And what we could also do with the tags, once we tagged the shark, we could take a photograph of the tag on the shark, and then we could scale it perfectly and work out exactly how long the shark was. So it was a very accurate, fantastic way of working with these animals and actually gathering data. So over a period of time, a couple of weeks or whatever, we tag sharks and they'd move away and they'd come back, etc., etc. But so there's two things that came up from this. Two things that we learned very early in the 90s about their biology, was that they were very site orientated, which meant they moved from one white shark site to another. So site orientation. It wasn't just random. So that was an important, a very, very important lesson. That was very important data that we learned about the great white shark, because what it told us is that they're vulnerable. Because if they are moving from site to site and they're gathering in sites, then it was very easy for sports fishermen or commercial fishermen to go out to these sites and actually find great white sharks easily and catch them and kill them. So that was very important for us, because we could identify the white shark sites, and therefore we had good reason if we needed to protect those specific sites. So that was very important. The other thing we learned, and this was about their movement and their grouping, was that great white sharks would actually move together. We don't understand this completely. We don't understand all the dynamics about their movement when it comes to actually moving together. But through the tagging, we would find that, for example, it was probably, I think about 93, we were out at Dyer Island, and I tagged, I don't know, on that day, probably about 9 great white sharks. And exactly 3 months later, to the day, to the sharks, and I can't remember the numbers of the sharks. Let's say it was green A and green B, okay? But exactly 3 months later, to the day, we were in Straits Bay. And green A and green B turned up at the boat at exactly the same time. So they had moved together. And it wasn't just coincidence, because we noticed this a number of times. We tagged sharks at Dyer Island and they'd move away, and then the same sharks would often come back together. So we tagged shark red A, B, and C, and 3 weeks later they disappear, and 3 weeks later, or 2 weeks later, or 2 months later, those sharks would come back to the island together as a little group. So they were actually moving around together. Not all of them. They broke away. And like I said, we don't understand all the dynamics. We don't understand if it's to do with size or a period of their life cycle. I believe it's got to do with a period of their life cycle and size, because generally it was the subadults that were moving around together, not the adults. The adults seem to be more sporadic and moved around more individually, independently, for want of a better term. So that is what we've learned from the tagging of the great white sharks about their movement. So I spoke about distribution, white shark sites, and movement between these sites. And our tagging taught us that there was a lot of site utilization, which was very important. I'm just summarizing. Very, very important in terms of the impact the sharks have on these sites. And again, the vulnerability of these species if they are moving from one side to the other. And just to qualify this, before the great white shark was protected, and just by the way, our team, the White Shark Research Project, the White Shark Research Unit, and ultimately when we also became the White Shark Research Institute. But before we became the White Shark Research Institute, we were the White Shark Research Unit, and our unit were the ones responsible for having the great white shark protected. In April of 1991, we made history, world history, by becoming the first country in the world to protect public enemy number one, the great white shark, and our team. I'm very proud of that. Our team were completely 100% responsible for that. Now, what was I thinking about? I got all excited about that. But before we got the white shark protected, myself and one of my colleagues, Mike Boone, we were sent on a fact-finding mission. And we went to different areas. We went to Straits Bay, we went to Mossel Bay, and we were trying to figure out how many great white sharks were being caught. And in 1 month, 17 great white sharks were caught at Dyer Island. So you can imagine that if we didn't get the white shark protected, that there would be no more great white sharks along our coastline. They'd be decimated completely. 17 animals killed in 1 month. So that is why the distribution and the tagging, which showed us site utilization, became so very important, because it gave us a very strong case, a very strong reason to go to the government and say, listen, these animals need to be protected. And once they were protected, we were able to go to the government after 5 years in 1995, when I wrote the paper on population dynamics, and we could show the government, because the protection laws were preemptive. We were told, okay, we'll protect the white shark, but you have to prove that they require constant protection. They require long-term protection. And in 95, I wrote a paper called Population Dynamics of the Great White Shark along the Southern African coastline. And in that paper, we were able to show the government, yes, these animals have got a high degree of site utilization, therefore they're very vulnerable to exploitation, therefore they need to be protected, and today they are still protected. So there we go, video number 4. I hope you enjoyed that. Interesting stuff. And yeah, I'll catch you on the next video. Thank you very much.